In 1942, during World War II, the Atlantic Ocean became one of the most dangerous places on Earth. It did not look like a battlefield. There were no trenches carved into the sea and no marching armies across the waves. From a distance, it looked calm, endless, almost peaceful. But beneath that surface, German submarines moved silently. These U-boats hunted cargo ships traveling from North America to Britain. Those ships carried food, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and thousands of soldiers. Britain depended completely on these supplies. Without them, factories would slow, armies would weaken, and civilians would begin to suffer shortages. The Atlantic was not just water. It was a lifeline. German submarines were strategic and patient. They waited in shipping lanes and attacked at night. A single torpedo could rip open the side of a steel ship in seconds. Fire would rise, metal would bend, and within minutes the ocean would swallow everything. Many sailors never saw the submarine that destroyed them. By early 1942, the rate of sinkings became alarming. Allied leaders realized that if the Atlantic supply line collapsed, the war in Europe could be lost. The United States had recently entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. America now faced an enormous logistical problem: how to transport millions of troops and massive quantities of equipment across an ocean filled with submarines. The first response was simple: build more ships. And America did exactly that. Shipyards expanded rapidly. Steel mills ran day and night. Workers took shifts around the clock. One of the major industrial leaders behind this effort was Henry J. Kaiser, who revolutionized ship production speed. Liberty ships were built faster than anyone thought possible. The United States earned the nickname Arsenal of Democracy. But even as ship production increased, submarines continued sinking them. It became a race between production and destruction. And sometimes destruction was winning. Military planners began thinking differently. What if the ocean itself was the problem? What if the solution was not to send more ships into danger, but to avoid the water entirely? What if troops and equipment could travel above the Atlantic instead of through it? Air transport existed, but aircraft at that time were limited. They could carry dozens of soldiers, not hundreds. Crossing the Atlantic required fuel stops, which created vulnerability. But war changes imagination. Ideas that once sounded impossible begin to feel necessary. A bold concept began forming. Build a flying boat so enormous that it could carry hundreds of troops in a single trip. It would take off from water, land on water, and cross the ocean without stopping. No submarines. No torpedoes. Just sky. The idea seemed unrealistic. Too big. Too risky. Too expensive. But that is when the proposal reached Howard Hughes. Hughes was already known as a bold and unconventional figure. He inherited wealth from his father's company, became a Hollywood film producer, broke aviation speed records, and personally tested aircraft designs. He was intelligent, intense, and deeply perfectionistic. He disliked limits. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. When Hughes heard about the need for a massive transport aircraft, he imagined something unprecedented. Not just a large plane. The largest ever built. It would redefine aviation. It would carry tanks or hundreds of soldiers. It would cross oceans in one flight. But there was a serious obstacle. During World War II, aluminum was urgently needed for combat aircraft such as the P-51 Mustang and the B-17 Flying Fortress. Diverting huge amounts of metal for an experimental transport aircraft would not be acceptable. So Hughes made a controversial decision. The aircraft would be built mostly from laminated wood. Layers of birch would be glued and pressed together using a special molding process. This technique created strong, lightweight structures while saving aluminum for fighters and bombers. From an engineering perspective, it was innovative. From a public perspective, it sounded foolish. Newspapers quickly mocked the concept and gave it a nickname meant to ridicule it, the Spruce Goose. The name suggested something fragile and clumsy. Hughes hated it, but it spread quickly. The official name of the aircraft would be the Hughes H-4 Hercules. Construction began in Long Beach, California, inside a massive hangar. Workers assembled enormous wooden ribs forming the skeleton of a machine unlike anything the world had seen. At this stage, the aircraft was still an idea turning into reality. It had not flown. It had not been tested. It had not yet faced political criticism. It existed because fear demanded innovation and because one man believed scale could overcome danger. While submarines hunted ships in the Atlantic and factories roared across America, a wooden giant slowly began to rise on the west coast. The crisis is growing, the aircraft is under construction, and time is moving faster than anyone realizes. By the time the idea of the massive flying boat became official, the pressure of war was already shaping every decision. The project was no longer just a bold engineering experiment. It was tied to national survival. If it succeeded, it could transform long-distance transport. If it failed, it would become an expensive symbol of wartime overconfidence. In Long Beach, California, a massive hangar was constructed to house what would become the largest aircraft ever built. Workers entering the structure for the first time often described it as overwhelming. The building itself felt like a cathedral of engineering. Inside, blueprints stretched across long drafting tables. Engineers calculated weight distribution, wing loading, lift coefficients, and structural stress. Everything had to be precise. At that size, even small miscalculations could lead to disaster. The aircraft was officially named the Hughes H-4 Hercules. Its projected wingspan would reach approximately 320 feet, longer than a football field. The fuselage would tower above workers standing beneath it. 8 massive radial engines would power it. The aircraft would weigh around 180 tons when fully loaded. No aircraft of this scale had ever been attempted before. The choice of wood continued to attract attention. Hughes and his team used laminated birch bonded together through a process that created strong, curved structural components. Layers were glued and compressed under heat and pressure. The result was surprisingly durable. The technique conserved critical wartime aluminum while maintaining structural integrity. Still, critics remained skeptical. Many could not imagine a wooden aircraft surviving ocean takeoffs and landings, let alone carrying hundreds of troops across the Atlantic. Construction moved forward, but not quickly enough for wartime expectations. Hughes was deeply involved in the details. He personally reviewed design modifications. He demanded refinements. He rejected components that did not meet his standards. Workers sometimes found his perfectionism exhausting. To Hughes, precision was non-negotiable. He believed the aircraft must not merely function, it had to perform flawlessly. Meanwhile, the war did not pause. Across the Atlantic, Allied forces were adapting to submarine threats. Convoy systems improved. Air patrol coverage expanded. New detection technologies such as sonar and improved radar made it harder for submarines to operate freely. The Battle of the Atlantic slowly began shifting in the Allies' favor. Sinkings did not stop entirely, but the crisis was no longer as catastrophic as it had been in early 1942. This shift created an uncomfortable reality for the H-4 project. The aircraft had been conceived during desperation. But desperation was easing. As months passed, the urgency that justified such an extreme solution began to soften. Inside the Long Beach facility, however, the scale of the project only grew more demanding. The wings alone required immense structural reinforcement. Engineers had to calculate how to distribute weight across such a vast span without causing flex that could lead to structural failure. The engines had to be synchronized perfectly. Fuel storage had to be balanced carefully to avoid instability. The hull, designed to land and take off from water, required both aerodynamic and hydrodynamic efficiency. Every component was oversized. Every problem was magnified. Financial costs rose steadily. The project eventually consumed more than $20 million, a massive sum during the 1940s. Government officials began asking questions. Was the aircraft progressing fast enough? Would it be operational in time to serve its intended wartime purpose? Could resources be better allocated elsewhere? Hughes insisted that the aircraft required careful development. Rushing it would risk catastrophic failure. He believed that once completed, it would demonstrate capabilities that critics could not yet comprehend. But time was becoming the most dangerous enemy of the project. By 1944, Allied forces had gained significant momentum in Europe. D-Day had taken place. The war was turning decisively. The need for a massive transatlantic troop transport was less urgent than it had been 2 years earlier. Cargo ships, protected by improved convoy systems and air cover, were surviving at higher rates. Inside the hangar, the Hercules continued taking shape. Its massive ribs were enclosed with laminated panels. The cockpit was assembled. Control systems were installed. 8 Pratt & Whitney engines were mounted along the wings. Workers standing beneath them looked small in comparison. The aircraft's presence was overwhelming. It no longer felt theoretical. It was real. Yet with each passing month, whispers grew louder outside the hangar. Some members of Congress began questioning whether the project had become an expensive vanity effort. Newspapers revived the nickname Spruce Goose more frequently. Public perception shifted from curiosity to skepticism. Then, in 1945, Germany surrendered. Soon after, Japan surrendered as well. World War II ended. The aircraft built to solve a wartime crisis was not yet complete when the war itself concluded. The central justification for its existence had vanished. This created a profound turning point. Without the urgency of submarine threats dominating headlines, the H-4 Hercules faced a different kind of challenge. It now had to justify itself in peacetime. Government scrutiny intensified. Officials examined expenditures more closely. The project that once symbolized innovation under pressure began to look, to some critics, like an unnecessary expense. For Howard Hughes, this shift was deeply personal. He had invested not only money and engineering effort but also pride. He believed the aircraft represented technological progress, not waste. He was convinced it could fly. He was convinced it would prove its critics wrong. Inside the massive hangar in Long Beach, the wooden giant stood nearly complete. Its wings stretched outward like something unreal. Its engines waited for ignition. It was too large to ignore and too expensive to dismiss quietly, with the aircraft physically assembled but politically vulnerable. The war has ended. The urgency has faded. Questions are growing louder. When World War II ended in 1945, celebrations erupted across the United States. Soldiers returned home. Factories slowed their wartime production. The urgency that had once justified extreme decisions began to fade. But inside a massive hangar in Long Beach, California, the Hughes H-4 Hercules still stood incomplete. It had been conceived during crisis. It had been funded under the pressure of submarine warfare. But now the war was over, and the giant aircraft had never flown. This is when the tone of the story changed. Government officials began reviewing wartime contracts. Billions of dollars had been spent across multiple projects. Some had succeeded brilliantly. Others had been cancelled or delayed. The H-4 Hercules stood out because of its scale and cost. More than $20 million had been invested in its development. In peacetime, that number seemed enormous. Questions began circulating in Washington. Why had the aircraft taken so long? Why had it not been completed before the war ended? Was it ever truly practical? Had public funds been misused? Newspapers revived the nickname that Howard Hughes despised, the Spruce Goose. Headlines framed it as a symbol of waste. Cartoonists sketched exaggerated wooden airplanes flapping like toys. Public opinion slowly shifted. What had once been seen as bold innovation now looked, to some critics, like an expensive experiment with no purpose. The scrutiny intensified when the US Senate began investigating wartime defense spending. Committees were formed to examine contracts, budgets, and delivery schedules. Hughes was called to testify. For a man who preferred privacy and control, the public hearings were uncomfortable and confrontational. Senators questioned him sharply. They suggested that delays were unacceptable. They implied that the project had been poorly managed. Some hinted that it had been driven more by ego than necessity. Hughes did not respond quietly. He defended the aircraft with determination. He explained the engineering complexity. He described the material shortages during wartime. He emphasized that building the largest aircraft in history required innovation and time. He rejected the idea that it was a failure. At one point during testimony, Hughes made a bold statement that captured national attention. He declared that if the aircraft did not fly, he would likely leave the country and never return. It was more than a technical defense. It was personal. He had tied his reputation to the aircraft's success. The hearings became widely covered by the media. The public watched as a wealthy industrialist defended a wooden giant that had not yet proven itself. For some, Hughes appeared stubborn. For others, he appeared courageous. Meanwhile, back in Long Beach, the aircraft was nearly complete. Workers continued final adjustments. Systems were tested carefully. Engineers checked control surfaces. Fuel systems were inspected. Engines were examined repeatedly. The Hercules was no longer an unfinished structure. It was a fully assembled machine waiting for one thing: proof. The political atmosphere surrounding the project created intense pressure. Hughes understood that technical explanations alone would not silence critics. Only performance could do that. The challenge was immense. The aircraft weighed around 180 tons. Its wingspan stretched 320 feet. No plane of that size had ever left the water. Calculations suggested it could fly, but calculations are not the same as reality. Skeptics predicted disaster. Some believed it would never leave the water. Others feared structural failure. The idea of a giant wooden aircraft lifting into the air seemed improbable. Yet Hughes remained determined. He personally oversaw preparations for a series of taxi tests in Long Beach Harbor. Officially, these tests were meant only to evaluate water handling and engine performance. They were not announced as flight attempts. But Hughes had something else in mind. The atmosphere before the test was tense. Reporters gathered. Cameras were positioned along the shoreline. Observers wanted to see whether the enormous wooden machine would embarrass itself or silence criticism. For Hughes, the moment was no longer just about engineering. It was about credibility. Years of work, millions of dollars, public scrutiny, and personal pride had all led to this point. Inside the cockpit, controls were checked. 8 massive engines were prepared for ignition. The wooden giant rested on the water, looking almost unreal in its size. It dwarfed nearby boats. It seemed too large to belong in the air. The nation waited just before the engines roared to life. Investigations have questioned the project. Hughes has made a public promise. The aircraft stands ready in the harbor. By November 1947, more than 2 years after the end of World War II, the giant aircraft finally faced its moment of truth. The Hughes H-4 Hercules rested in Long Beach Harbor, floating quietly on the water. It looked less like an airplane and more like a floating building with wings. Its 320-foot wingspan stretched wider than anything ever built to fly. 8 massive engines sat along the wing, silent but powerful. Crowds gathered along the shoreline. Reporters carried cameras and notebooks. Some came expecting to witness history. Others came expecting to witness failure. The nickname Spruce Goose still echoed in newspapers. Many believed it was too heavy, too large, too unrealistic to ever leave the water. Officially, the event was described as a taxi test. Engineers would run the engines and evaluate how the aircraft handled across the harbor's surface. No formal flight attempt had been announced. The risk of public embarrassment was too great. Howard Hughes arrived dressed carefully, composed but determined. The previous months of Senate hearings and accusations had pushed him into a corner. His reputation depended on this machine. He had promised it would fly. Inside the cockpit, Hughes personally took the controls. He did not delegate this moment to another pilot. He trusted his own judgment more than anyone else's. Instruments were checked repeatedly. Control surfaces were tested. Fuel systems were confirmed stable. Then the engines started. One by one, the 8 radial engines roared to life. The sound echoed across the harbor. It was deep and mechanical, almost thunderous. Water rippled outward as the propellers spun faster. The massive wooden hull vibrated slightly under the force. The aircraft began moving forward slowly at first, cutting through the water. Spray rose behind it. Observers watched closely. The Hercules picked up speed. It moved faster than many expected. The hull began to lift slightly as it gained momentum. Engine power increased again. The aircraft skimmed across the water's surface, throwing a wide trail of spray behind it. Reporters leaned forward. Some thought this was the maximum it could achieve, fast taxiing, nothing more. But Hughes continued accelerating. At a critical speed, lift began to overcome weight. The massive wings, stretching farther than a football field, caught the air. Slowly, almost gently, the hull separated from the water. It did not leap upward dramatically. It rose gradually, smoothly, as if testing the sky. The largest aircraft ever built had left the surface. It climbed to approximately 70 feet above the harbor. Not high, but clearly airborne. It remained in the air for about 26 seconds and traveled roughly 1 mile before Hughes eased it back down onto the water. The landing was controlled. Calm. Intentional. For a brief moment after touchdown, there was silence. Then cheers erupted from parts of the crowd. Even skeptics were forced to acknowledge what had just happened. The giant wooden aircraft had flown. It had not broken apart. It had not stalled. It had not failed. For 26 seconds, it proved its capability. Hughes had kept his promise. Yet the flight was short. It was not a long-distance journey across the Atlantic. It did not carry troops or tanks. It did not enter production. It demonstrated possibility, not transformation. In practical terms, the aircraft was already obsolete. By 1947, aviation technology had advanced rapidly. New metal aircraft designs were emerging. Military needs had shifted. The war that inspired the Hercules was long over. After that single flight, the aircraft never flew again. But those 26 seconds altered the narrative. What critics had labeled a complete failure became something more complicated. It was no longer accurate to say it could not fly. It had flown. The question changed from "can it fly?" to "why was it built so late?" With the aircraft resting again on the water, engines cooling, its brief flight already becoming legend. The giant that never flew again. After the brief flight over Long Beach Harbor, the Hughes H-4 Hercules returned to the water and was guided back toward its dock. The engines were shut down one by one. The massive propellers slowed. The harbor became quiet again. The largest aircraft ever built had proven it could leave the surface of the ocean. But what happened next was not expansion, not production, not military deployment. There were no follow-up test programs. No contracts for additional units. No redesigns for combat service. The world had moved on. By 1947, Aviation technology was entering a new era. Jet engines were beginning to dominate military aircraft development. Metal construction techniques had improved significantly. Long-range cargo planes made from aluminum were becoming more efficient and practical. The unique wartime emergency that justified a giant wooden flying boat no longer existed. The Hercules had answered the question of flight, but it could not answer the question of necessity. Howard Hughes, however, did not abandon it. In fact, he protected it with remarkable dedication. He ordered that the aircraft be stored in a climate-controlled hangar to prevent damage. A small team of workers was hired to maintain it continuously. They cleaned it, preserved its wooden surfaces, inspected components, and ensured it remained in flight-ready condition for years. The cost of maintaining the aircraft after its single flight was significant. Hughes paid much of it himself. For him, the aircraft represented more than a government contract. It symbolized innovation, defiance, and proof that critics had been wrong. Yet despite its preservation, the Hercules never flew again. As time passed, Howard Hughes became increasingly reclusive. He withdrew from public life and business appearances. His name remained linked to aviation and industry, but he avoided public scrutiny. The Spruce Goose became a quiet relic of a dramatic moment rather than an active part of aviation development. In the broader context of history, the aircraft took on a different identity. It became a symbol of ambition during crisis. It represented how fear and urgency during World War II pushed engineers to attempt what had once seemed impossible. It also became an example of how technology can arrive too late to fulfill its intended role. For decades, the massive wooden aircraft remained stored, carefully preserved but largely unseen by the public. Eventually, after Hughes' death, it was moved and later displayed for public viewing. Today, it is housed at the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum in Oregon, where visitors can stand beneath its enormous wings and understand its scale in person. Standing under it, one realizes how extraordinary it truly was. The wings stretch so far that they seem almost unreal. The fuselage rises like a building. It feels less like a machine and more like a monument. The Hercules did not transport soldiers across the Atlantic. It did not change the outcome of World War II. It did not enter mass production. But it did something else. It proved that the boundary of possibility is often pushed during moments of fear and urgency. It showed that engineering ambition can reach astonishing heights, even if timing determines whether that ambition becomes essential or obsolete. In the end, the Spruce Goose was neither complete failure nor practical success. It was a creation born from wartime desperation, completed in peacetime skepticism, and remembered as one of the boldest aviation experiments ever attempted. Its story is not about victory in battle. It is about scale, pride, innovation, criticism, and proof. For 26 seconds, it rose above the water and silenced doubt. And sometimes, in history, that is enough to become legend. This is another video in the early 1930s, long before flames rose over Pearl Harbor. The leaders of the Imperial Japanese Navy were already thinking about a future war. They understood something deeply uncomfortable. The United States possessed greater industrial capacity, more steel mills, more oil reserves, more shipyards, more raw resources. If a prolonged naval war ever began, America could outproduce Japan again and again. Japan could not win a war of numbers. So Japanese naval planners developed a different philosophy. If you cannot build more ships than your enemy, build ships so powerful that each one is worth several of theirs. This idea would lead to the creation of the most powerful battleship ever constructed, the Japanese battleship Yamato. The concept began quietly after Japan withdrew from naval treaty limitations in the mid-1930s. The Washington Naval Treaty had restricted battleship size and gun caliber. But once Japan stepped away from those restrictions, its designers were free to think bigger. And they did. Secret meetings were held. Naval architects drafted plans that seemed almost unbelievable. The new battleship would be massive, far larger than any ship afloat. It would carry guns no other navy could match. It would be armored heavily enough to withstand enemy fire in a traditional surface battle. Construction began in 1937 at the Kure Naval Arsenal. But it was done under extreme secrecy. The dry dock was screened off. Workers were forbidden from speaking about the project. Even neighboring civilians could not see clearly what was being assembled. Japan wanted the world, especially the United States, to remain unaware. As the hull began to take shape, the scale became undeniable. The ship would displace roughly 72,000 tons fully loaded. At the time, most battleships ranged between 35,000 and 45,000 tons. Yamato was nearly double that weight. Her main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, mounted in 3 enormous turrets. Each shell weighed over 1.5 tons. When fired, the blast from a single salvo could shake the ship violently. These guns had the potential to strike enemy ships at distances exceeding 25 miles. Her armor was equally impressive. The belt armor along her sides measured up to 16 inches thick. Beneath the surface, complex torpedo defense systems were built into her hull. The deck armor was reinforced to protect against plunging shellfire. She was designed for one purpose: to defeat enemy battleships in a decisive engagement. But as Yamato grew in steel and strength, naval warfare itself was evolving. In December 1941, Yamato was commissioned into service. Just days earlier, Japanese aircraft had attacked Pearl Harbor, damaging much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The era of aircraft carriers had announced itself dramatically. Still, many Japanese naval leaders believed battleships would ultimately decide the war. Carriers might weaken the enemy, but a final surface confrontation would settle the outcome. In that climactic battle, Yamato would be Japan's ultimate weapon. She became the flagship of the combined fleet. Sailors walking her decks felt pride. The ship represented national power. It was a floating fortress. Yet even as Yamato joined the fleet, events in the Pacific were shifting quickly. Aircraft carriers began proving their dominance. At battles such as Coral Sea and Midway, fleets fought without ever seeing each other directly. Planes launched from distant decks inflicted devastating damage. Battleships, despite their size and firepower, struggled to respond to threats they could not reach. Yamato's immense guns were designed for surface duels. But in the vast Pacific, aircraft could strike from beyond the horizon. For much of 1942 and 1943, Yamato saw limited direct action. She spent time anchored at secure bases such as Truk Lagoon. Part of the hesitation came from caution. Japan understood that losing its largest and most powerful battleship would be a severe blow to morale and prestige. And so the giant often waited. She trained. She maneuvered. She escorted other vessels. But she did not unleash the full fury of her guns in the decisive battle her designers had imagined. Meanwhile, the United States accelerated production. American shipyards launched carriers, destroyers, and submarines at astonishing rates. Radar technology improved. Pilot training intensified. Industrial output dwarfed Japanese capacity. The balance of power began shifting steadily. Yamato, once conceived as the solution to industrial inferiority, now faced a strategic reality she could not control. She was powerful, yes, but she was only one ship. And modern naval warfare was becoming a contest of aircraft, logistics, and supply lines. In 1943, Yamato was struck by an American submarine torpedo. Though she survived and returned for repairs, the attack demonstrated a hard truth: Even the largest battleship was vulnerable. Steel thickness could not prevent underwater explosions from tearing into hull plating. Repairs strengthened her anti-aircraft armament. More smaller guns were added to defend against planes. Radar systems were installed and upgraded. The ship evolved, adapting to the growing air threat. But adaptation had limits. The war in the Pacific grew increasingly brutal. Island campaigns brought American forces closer to Japan. Each lost island tightened the strategic noose. Fuel shortages began affecting Japanese operations. Aircraft losses mounted. Carrier battles had reduced Japan's experienced pilot pool dramatically. Yamato still existed as a symbol of power. Yet symbols do not win wars alone. As 1944 approached, it became clear that the decisive confrontation the Japanese Navy had anticipated was not unfolding as planned. Instead of a traditional battleship duel, the war had become a sprawling struggle dominated by air power and industrial might. Yamato was the largest battleship ever built. She embodied engineering ambition and national pride. But she was entering a battlefield that no longer favored her design. By 1942, the Pacific War was no longer a contest of isolated raids. It had become a vast struggle stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Aircraft carriers were proving decisive. Radar was improving. Submarines prowled shipping lanes. Yet in the center of Japan's naval strength floated its largest creation, the Japanese battleship Yamato. Yamato spent much of 1942 and 1943 stationed at major naval anchorages such as Truk Lagoon. These bases were considered secure strongholds, surrounded by layers of defense. The Japanese High Command hesitated to risk its most powerful battleship unnecessarily. Losing her would not only be a tactical setback, it would damage national morale. So the giant often waited. Her crew trained relentlessly. Gunnery drills echoed across the deck. Massive 18.1-inch shells were hoisted into turrets during exercises. Fire control systems were calibrated carefully. Officers studied potential battle scenarios in which Yamato's guns would devastate American battleships in a decisive surface engagement. But the decisive battle did not come. Instead, aircraft carriers clashed far beyond the visible horizon. In the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, fleets fought without their battleships exchanging direct fire. Aircraft launched from hundreds of miles away delivered the destruction. At Midway, Japan lost 4 carriers in a single catastrophic battle. It was a strategic turning point. Yamato's immense guns never fired in anger during those critical engagements. The war's center of gravity was shifting upward, into the sky. By 1943, American submarines intensified attacks on Japanese shipping. Supply lines were strained. Oil tankers were sunk. The flow of fuel from Southeast Asia to Japan began to falter. Even a battleship as mighty as Yamato required enormous quantities of fuel to operate. Each deployment consumed resources Japan could barely replace. In December 1943, Yamato herself was struck by a torpedo from the American submarine USS Skate. The explosion tore into her hull. Though her armor and compartmentalization prevented sinking, the damage forced her back to Japan for repairs. It was a sobering moment. The largest battleship ever built had been wounded by a submarine, a relatively small and stealthy enemy. The incident demonstrated that size and armor could not guarantee immunity. During repairs, Yamato's anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened. More 25mm anti-aircraft guns were added across her decks. Radar systems were upgraded to detect incoming aircraft earlier. The ship was adapting to the reality of air-dominated warfare. In 1944, the war intensified dramatically. The United States advanced through the Central Pacific, capturing island after island. Each captured base brought American bombers closer to Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy prepared for what it believed would be a decisive confrontation near the Philippines. This confrontation became the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Yamato sailed as part of a massive fleet assembled to counter American forces. The Japanese hoped to cripple U.S. carrier strength in one overwhelming blow. But the battle unfolded as a catastrophic defeat for Japan. American pilots shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Yamato again saw limited direct action. Her guns did not engage enemy battleships. Instead, she maneuvered defensively as carrier aircraft determined the outcome. The loss of experienced Japanese pilots further weakened the Navy's striking power. By October 1944, another major confrontation loomed, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles in history. Yamato participated more directly in this campaign. As part of Vice Admiral Kurita's center force, she advanced toward American landing forces in the Philippines. The plan was complex and risky. Japanese naval units would converge from multiple directions, hoping to disrupt the American invasion. During the battle off Samar, Yamato finally fired her massive main guns at enemy ships. She engaged American escort carriers and destroyers in a chaotic and intense engagement. The thunder of her 18.1-inch guns shook the sea. Water columns rose high as shells impacted. Yet despite her overwhelming firepower, the situation was confused. American destroyers launched aggressive torpedo attacks. Aircraft from small escort carriers struck repeatedly. Smoke screens obscured visibility. Communication breakdowns created uncertainty. Admiral Kurita ultimately withdrew his force, fearing further losses and unaware of the full American situation. Leyte Gulf marked another turning point. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost significant ships and could no longer conduct large-scale offensive operations effectively. Fuel shortages grew critical. Training standards declined. Air cover became unreliable. Yamato remained afloat, powerful but increasingly isolated in a shrinking strategic landscape. By late 1944, American air raids began striking Japanese home waters more frequently. Industrial production in Japan suffered. The naval balance was no longer uncertain. It had decisively shifted. The giant battleship, once envisioned as the ultimate solution to industrial disadvantage, now faced a harsh truth. Naval warfare had evolved beyond her original purpose. Aircraft ruled the Pacific. Yamato's thick armor and colossal guns were extraordinary achievements of engineering. But they were tools designed for a type of battle that rarely materialized. Yamato still afloat but surrounded by strategic decline. The war has turned against Japan. Fuel is scarce. Air superiority belongs to the United States. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final and most brutal phase. The Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer the confident force that had struck Pearl Harbor just 3 years earlier. Aircraft carriers had been lost. Experienced pilots were gone. Fuel reserves were dangerously low. American submarines controlled vast stretches of sea, cutting off supply lines. U.S. aircraft now bombed Japanese cities with increasing frequency. And still, anchored in home waters, floated the largest battleship ever built, the Japanese battleship Yamato. She remained powerful. Her guns were unmatched. Her armor was thick. But power without air cover had become a liability. By 1945, American industry was producing ships and aircraft at a scale Japan could not comprehend. Dozens of aircraft carriers operated across the Pacific. Carrier-based planes could strike targets hundreds of miles away. Radar-directed anti-aircraft fire and well-trained pilots dominated the skies. Yamato's role grew increasingly uncertain. Fuel shortages limited her movement. Each time she sailed, It consumed precious resources that Japan could barely replace. Naval planners understood that preserving the remaining fleet was important, yet inactivity meant irrelevance. Then came Okinawa. In April 1945, American forces began the invasion of Okinawa, an island strategically close to Japan's home islands. If Okinawa fell, and it was falling, American bombers would be able to strike Japan with even greater intensity. The invasion represented a direct threat to the homeland. Japanese military leadership faced a harsh reality. Their navy could no longer defeat the United States in open battle. Their air forces were weakened. Kamikaze attacks, deliberate suicide strikes by aircraft, had become increasingly common, reflecting desperation rather than dominance. Within this atmosphere of urgency and resignation, a bold and tragic plan was proposed. Operation Tengo. The idea was simple in concept and devastating in implication. Yamato would sail toward Okinawa with a small escort of cruisers and destroyers. She would have only enough fuel for a one-way journey. There was no expectation of return. The mission was essentially a suicide operation. The plan called for Yamato to reach Okinawa, beach herself intentionally, and act as a stationary coastal gun battery. Her massive guns would fire upon American forces until she was destroyed. It was not a strategy aimed at victory. It was a gesture of defiance. Some Japanese naval officers opposed the mission, recognizing it as futile. Without air cover, Yamato would be exposed to overwhelming American carrier aircraft. The United States had dozens of carriers operating near Okinawa. The skies were controlled by American fighters. But in the mindset of Japan's final war months, symbolic resistance mattered. Yamato, as the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, represented national pride. Sending her into battle, even on a doomed mission, carried emotional weight. On April 6, 1945, Yamato prepared to sail. Her crew understood the situation. Many suspected they would not return. Some wrote farewell letters. Others stood quietly on deck, aware that they were participating in what might be their final operation. The ship departed with limited escort vessels. There was no strong air cover. Japan simply did not have the aircraft to provide it. As Yamato moved southward, American submarines detected her. Reports were transmitted quickly. U.S. carrier task forces were alerted. The largest battleship ever constructed was at sea, and vulnerable. American commanders did not need to risk their own battleships. They had aircraft. Hundreds of them. Carrier decks became active. Bombs were loaded. Torpedoes were secured beneath wings. Pilots were briefed. The strategy was clear: overwhelm Yamato with repeated waves of air attacks. On board Yamato, preparations were made for combat. Anti-aircraft guns were manned. Radar scanned the skies. The crew waited. They were sailing not toward victory, but toward history. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic naval finales of World War II. On April 7, 1945, the ocean south of Japan was calm. The Japanese battleship Yamato moved steadily through the water, escorted by a light cruiser and several destroyers. The formation was tight but small. There were no aircraft circling above to protect them. Japan no longer had the strength to provide that shield. On board Yamato, tension was thick. Radar operators scanned the skies. Anti-aircraft crews stood ready beside their guns. Officers understood the reality. The United States Navy had overwhelming air superiority in the region. If American carriers launched aircraft, Yamato would have to face them alone. Late in the morning, radar contacts appeared. American scout planes had already located the Japanese force. Soon, the first wave of carrier-based aircraft approached. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers descended from the sky in coordinated attack patterns. Fighters flew overhead to suppress defenses. The battle began from above. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns erupted in thunderous fire. Tracer rounds streaked upward. The sky filled with smoke bursts and sharp flashes. The battleship maneuvered as best she could, turning to reduce her profile against incoming torpedoes. But aircraft could attack from multiple directions at once. The first torpedoes struck along her port side. Explosions tore into the hull below the waterline. Compartments flooded. The ship listed slightly. Damage control teams rushed below decks to seal off flooded areas. Pumps were activated. Fire crews battled internal blazes. More aircraft arrived. Dive bombers screamed downward, releasing armor-piercing bombs aimed at her decks and superstructure. Bombs penetrated upper levels, igniting fires and killing crew members. Smoke began rising from multiple points. Yamato's size, once a symbol of dominance, now made her an enormous target. Wave after wave of American aircraft attacked. Torpedoes slammed into her sides repeatedly. With each impact, flooding increased. The list to port grew more severe. Counter-flooding procedures were attempted to balance the ship, but damage spread rapidly. Inside the ship, chaos intensified. Communications were disrupted. Power systems faltered. Fires raged in enclosed spaces. Sailors worked desperately in smoke-filled compartments, aware that survival was slipping away. Despite the overwhelming assault, Yamato continued firing her anti-aircraft guns. Some American aircraft were shot down. Pilots later described the defensive fire as intense and dangerous. But the numerical advantage of U.S. forces was too great. After numerous torpedo hits and bomb strikes, Yamato's port list became extreme. She began slowing. Steering became difficult. Internal explosions rocked the hull as ammunition stores were threatened. Shortly after 2 p.m., the end came. As flooding overwhelmed her compartments and fires spread uncontrollably, Yamato rolled further onto her port side. The massive hull tilted dramatically. Crew members were thrown across decks. Many were trapped below. Then a catastrophic explosion erupted from within. Her forward magazines detonated in a massive internal blast. A towering column of smoke and flame rose thousands of feet into the air. The explosion was so powerful that it was visible from great distances. Shockwaves rippled across the sea. The largest battleship ever built broke apart and sank beneath the water. Out of a crew of more than 3,000 men, only a few hundred survived. The rest went down with the ship. Operation Tengo had lasted only hours. Yamato had never reached Okinawa. She had never fired her main guns in support of ground forces. The mission, conceived as an act of defiance, ended in overwhelming destruction from the air. Her sinking marked more than the loss of a single ship. It symbolized the end of the battleship era. No matter how thick the armor or how large the guns, surface ships without air protection could not survive in modern naval warfare. Aircraft had proven decisive. The ocean closed over the wreckage, and the smoke column slowly faded. The giant that had been built to dominate the seas was gone. When the sea closed over the wreckage of the Japanese battleship Yamato on April 7, 1945, it marked more than the loss of a ship. It marked the end of an era. For centuries, naval power had been measured by the size of guns and the thickness of armor. The biggest ships carried the most influence. Battleships were symbols of national strength. They were floating fortresses, projecting power across oceans. Yamato had been the ultimate expression of that philosophy. But her destruction proved something irreversible. Air power had replaced armor. Aircraft had replaced artillery. Carriers had replaced battleships. Yamato was not defeated by another battleship in a dramatic duel of steel and fire. She was overwhelmed by waves of aircraft launched from carriers hundreds of miles away. The decisive weapon of the Pacific War was not the largest gun ever mounted on a ship. It was the airplane. For Japan, the sinking of Yamato was devastating. News of her loss spread carefully, as morale was already fragile. By April 1945, American bombers were striking Japanese cities regularly. Okinawa was falling. The war was approaching Japan's doorstep. The destruction of the Navy's greatest symbol reinforced what many leaders already understood. The war could no longer be won. For months later, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's declaration of war, Japan surrendered. World War II ended. Yamato lay deep beneath the sea, resting at a depth of more than 1,000 feet. For decades, her exact resting place remained largely undisturbed. Eventually, underwater expeditions located the wreck. Broken sections of her massive hull were discovered scattered across the seabed. Even in ruin, her scale remained impressive. In Japan, Yamato became something more than a warship. She became a symbol of sacrifice. Many of the sailors who perished during Operation Tengo were young. They had followed orders, aware that their mission offered little chance of survival. In post-war Japan, Yamato's story was often remembered with solemn reflection rather than triumph. In the city of Kyoto, where she had been built, the Yamato Museum was later established. Inside, a detailed scale model of the battleship stands as a reminder of both technological ambition and wartime tragedy. Visitors walk around it quietly, studying the enormous turrets and imagining the scale of the real vessel. Outside Japan, Yamato is studied as a turning point in naval warfare. Military historians analyze her design, her strengths, and her vulnerabilities. Engineers still marvel at the complexity of constructing such a massive ship in the 1930s. Yet they also recognize that strategic timing matters as much as technical brilliance. Yamato was not poorly built. She was not weak. She was simply designed for a type of war that was already fading. Her guns were unmatched. Her armor was extraordinary. Her size was unprecedented. But war evolves. By 1945, the decisive weapon was speed, range, and air superiority. A battleship without aircraft protection was exposed, no matter how powerful. In the decades after the war, Yamato's story entered books, documentaries, and films. She became both a warning and a legend. A warning about relying too heavily on past strategies. A legend because of her sheer scale and dramatic end. Today, when historians speak of the largest battleship ever built, her name is still mentioned first. Not because she won great victories, but because her story marks the moment when the age of battleships gave way to the age of aviation. The ocean that once reflected her massive silhouette now hides her beneath layers of salt and silence. Above, ships still cross the Pacific. Aircraft still fly overhead. Naval power continues to evolve. And somewhere in the deep water, the remains of Yamato rest as a reminder that even the greatest giants can fall when the world changes around them. Her story is not only about destruction. It is about transition. It is about ambition. It is about the end of one era and the beginning of another. And that is why, even decades later, the name Yamato still echoes across naval history. This is another video, the dream of reaching the edge of space. Long before the explosions over London. Long before the word missile became part of Cold War fear. There was a dream. Not a dream of destruction. A dream of space. In the 1920s and early 1930s, small groups of engineers and enthusiasts in Germany were fascinated by rockets. They were not thinking about war at first. They were thinking about the stars. Inspired by science fiction and early theorists like Hermann Oberth, these young engineers believed that rockets could one day reach outer space. Among them was a brilliant and ambitious student named Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was fascinated by the idea of space travel from an early age. He studied physics and engineering, dreaming not of bombs, but of moon rockets. However, dreams require funding. And in the Germany of the 1930s, there was only one institution willing to invest heavily in experimental technology: the military. After Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, Germany began rearming rapidly. The Treaty of Versailles had limited traditional weapons like artillery and aircraft. But rockets were a legal grey area. They were not specifically restricted. To German military planners, rockets offered something revolutionary. No pilot required. No anti-aircraft defense could intercept them. No warning before impact. The army began funding rocket research, and von Braun found himself working not for a civilian space program, but for the German military. By the mid-1930s, research was centralized at a remote facility on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde. There, engineers and scientists worked on liquid-fueled rocket prototypes. These early models were unstable and unpredictable. Some exploded on launch. Others veered off course. But progress was steady. The key breakthrough was liquid fuel propulsion. Unlike solid fuel rockets, liquid fuel allowed greater control and far more power. Engineers experimented with combinations of alcohol and liquid oxygen. Turbopumps fed propellant into combustion chambers at high pressure. Guidance systems were refined. By the early 1940s, the team had developed a prototype known as the A4. It was unlike anything the world had seen. Standing over 45 feet tall and weighing more than 12 tons at launch, the A4 rocket could reach speeds faster than sound. After launch, it climbed vertically into the upper atmosphere, reaching altitudes of over 50 miles before descending toward its target. Later, it would be renamed the V2, short for Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2. The name itself revealed its purpose. In 1943, Germany was no longer advancing victoriously across Europe. The tide of war had turned. Allied bombing raids were devastating German cities. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility. Hitler demanded a weapon that could strike back, something dramatic, unstoppable, terrifying. The V2 seemed perfect. Unlike the earlier V1 flying bomb, which could be intercepted by fighters or anti-aircraft guns, the V2 traveled at supersonic speed. Once launched, nothing could stop it. It followed a ballistic trajectory, rising high above conventional aircraft altitudes before plunging toward its target. When it hit, there was no warning siren in time to save anyone. The explosion came first. The sound followed. But before it became a weapon of terror, the program itself faced danger. In August 1943, British bombers launched Operation Hydra, a massive raid on Peenemünde. The Allies understood that Germany was developing advanced weapons and aimed to cripple the rocket program. The bombing killed scientists, engineers, and force laboris. Facilities were damaged. Yet the program survived. Production was moved underground to a vast facility carved into a mountain near Nordhausen. There, in tunnels known as the Mittelwerk, the V2 would be assembled in secrecy. But secrecy came with darkness. Thousands of prisoners from concentration camps were forced into brutal labor conditions to build the rockets. Starvation, disease, and abuse were common. Many died before ever seeing daylight again. The V2 was becoming more than a technological marvel. It was becoming a symbol of desperation. By 1944, Germany prepared to deploy the weapon operationally. Mobile launch platforms were developed. Crews could set up, fuel, and fire a rocket within hours, then relocate to avoid Allied retaliation. The first operational V2 launch against London occurred in September 1944. The age of ballistic missiles had begun. But even as rockets rose into the sky, Germany's situation on the ground deteriorated. Allied armies advanced from the west. The Soviet Union advanced from the east. Resources grew scarce. Fuel was limited. Cities burned nightly under bombing raids. The V2 was powerful. It was advanced. It was decades ahead of its time. But it entered the war at a moment when Germany was already losing. Part 1 ends here. With the V2 ready for widespread deployment, its technology revolutionary, its purpose destructive, and its creators standing at the edge of a collapsing regime. The Soundless Terror. In September 1944, the first operational V2 rocket rose into the sky from a hidden launch site in the Netherlands. There was no public announcement, no dramatic build-up, just a sudden eruption of flame beneath the rocket as liquid fuel ignited. The ground trembled. Smoke poured outward. The missile lifted vertically, faster and faster, until it vanished into the clouds. Its target was London. The V2 climbed nearly 50 miles above the Earth, reaching the edge of space. At that altitude, the sky darkened. The rocket then arced downward in a ballistic path, accelerating beyond the speed of sound. The people below had no warning. There was no air raid siren in time. No aircraft engine approaching. No whistle descending. The explosion came first. Only after impact did the thunder of displaced air reach the ears of survivors. On September 8, 1944, the first V2 struck the London suburb of Chiswick. Buildings collapsed instantly. Civilians were killed without ever knowing what had hit them. British officials were initially uncertain what had occurred. There was no plane debris. No crater from a conventional bomb dropped at an angle. The impact looked as if something had fallen straight down from unimaginable height. Soon, more rockets followed. Launch teams operated from forests, hidden clearings, and roadside sites across occupied Europe. The V2 was transported in pieces on trucks. It was erected on a mobile launch stand, fueled with liquid oxygen and alcohol, aligned carefully, and fired. Within hours, the launch crew would dismantle the equipment and disappear before Allied reconnaissance aircraft could locate them. This mobility made the system extremely difficult to destroy. Each rocket carried nearly a ton of explosive warhead. The blast could level buildings across a wide radius. Entire streets in London were torn apart. Windows shattered miles away. Fires erupted. Rescue workers rushed through rubble searching for survivors. But the V2 was not precise. Its guidance system relied on gyroscopes and primitive analog controls. While revolutionary for the 1940s, it could not strike individual military targets accurately. Instead, it hit general urban areas. London endured repeated attacks. Antwerp, a crucial Allied supply port in Belgium, became another primary target. Hundreds of V2 rockets fell there in late 1944 and early 1945, causing heavy civilian casualties and widespread destruction. The psychological effect was enormous. People feared a weapon that could not be stopped. Unlike the earlier V1 flying bomb, which could sometimes be shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft guns, the V2 traveled too fast. Once launched, it was unstoppable. British authorities attempted to minimize panic. Information was controlled. Reports were carefully managed. But word spread quickly that something new and terrifying was striking without warning. In Germany, propaganda portrayed the V2 as a miracle weapon, a wonderwaff that would reverse the war's fortunes. Speeches suggested that advanced technology would break Allied morale and force negotiations. But on the battlefield, reality was different. The Allies continued advancing across France and into Germany. American factories produced aircraft in overwhelming numbers. The Soviet Union pushed relentlessly from the east. Bombers struck German industrial centers nightly. The V2 could not halt armies. It could not defend territory. It could not prevent the collapse of supply lines. Each rocket required scarce resources. Liquid oxygen production was complex. Transport was risky under Allied air superiority. Skilled technicians were needed for fueling and calibration. Germany was running out of all of these. And behind the technological brilliance was a darker reality. After Allied bombing damaged the Peenemünde research facility, Production moved underground to the Mittelwerk factory near Nordhausen. Inside tunnels carved into a mountain, thousands of forced laborers from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp assembled the rockets. Conditions were brutal. Prisoners worked long hours in darkness, surrounded by dust and toxic fumes. Food was scarce. Disease spread rapidly. Guards enforced discipline through violence. It is estimated that more people died constructing the V2 than were killed by its explosions in Britain and Belgium. The rocket that represented futuristic engineering was built in medieval conditions. By early 1945, as Allied troops captured launch areas and bombed transportation networks, V2 operations became more difficult. Fewer sites were available. Fuel supplies diminished. Launch crews operated under increasing pressure. Yet the rockets continued rising into the sky. Each launch was a demonstration of technical achievement and a sign of strategic desperation. The V2 proved that ballistic missiles were possible. It showed that humanity could build a machine capable of reaching the edge of space and returning at supersonic speed. But it also revealed a painful truth. Technology alone cannot reverse a collapsing war. As Germany's borders shrank and Allied forces closed in, the V2 remained powerful but powerless to change the outcome. The weapon from the future had arrived. But it had arrived too late. The underground factory and the race for the future. By late 1944, the V2 rocket was no longer just a weapon launched from forests and hidden fields. It had become the center of one of the most secret and brutal industrial operations in Nazi Germany. After the bombing of Peenemünde in 1943, German leadership realized that above-ground facilities were too vulnerable to Allied air power. The solution was extreme. Production would move underground. Deep inside a mountain near Nordhausen, a massive tunnel complex known as Mittelwerk was converted into a rocket factory. The tunnels were damp, poorly ventilated, and carved directly from rock. Conveyor systems and assembly stations were installed. Parts were transported by rail directly into the mountain. The V2 would now be built in darkness. To supply labor, prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp were forced into the tunnels. Thousands were transported there under brutal conditions. They worked long hours assembling rocket components, installing wiring, attaching guidance systems, and preparing warheads. The air inside the tunnels was thick with dust and chemical fumes. Food rations were minimal. Disease spread quickly. Guards enforced discipline with violence. Many prisoners never saw daylight again. Historians estimate that more than 20,000 forced laborers died in connection with V2 production. Exhaustion, malnutrition, executions, and illness took a devastating toll. The rocket, often described as a technological marvel decades ahead of its time, was built on immense human suffering. Meanwhile, the military situation grew more desperate. By early 1945, Allied armies were pushing deep into Germany. American forces advanced from the west. Soviet forces moved relentlessly from the east. Launch sites were captured or destroyed. Fuel depots were bombed. Transportation networks were collapsing. And yet the V2 program continued. Why? Because both sides understood something important. The rocket was not only a weapon of the present. It was a weapon of the future. As Allied intelligence gathered more information about German rocket development, concern grew. Reports suggested that the V2 had reached the edge of space. Engineers studying fragments realized how advanced the guidance and propulsion systems were. The Allies did not want this technology falling into the hands of the Soviets alone. The Soviets did not want the Americans claiming it first. So even before Germany surrendered, a quiet race began. American troops moving into central Germany were given specific instructions: secure rocket facilities, capture documents, and, if possible, find the scientists responsible for the program. At the center of this effort was Wernher von Braun. Von Braun and many of his engineers understood that Germany was losing. They also understood that their expertise would be valuable to whichever power captured them. In the final months of the war, von Braun and his team made a critical decision. They would surrender to the Americans. In April 1945, as American forces approached, von Braun and several key rocket scientists traveled south into Bavaria. There, they made contact with US troops and offered their cooperation. This surrender would later become part of Operation Paperclip, a secret American program to bring German scientists to the United States. At the same time, American forces captured hundreds of V-2 rockets, parts, and blueprints from Mittelwerk and other facilities. Rail cars filled with rocket components were shipped to ports and transported across the Atlantic. The Soviets also captured rocket engineers and equipment in their zone of occupation. They dismantled factories and transported materials eastward. The V-2 program had collapsed with Nazi Germany. But its technology was about to reshape the world. The weapon that had fallen silently on London and Antwerp was now becoming the foundation for something larger: intercontinental ballistic missiles. And eventually, space exploration. The same rocket principles used to deliver warheads would soon be used to launch satellites into orbit. The same propulsion systems that once spread fear would send humans beyond Earth. In the final days of the war, as Germany crumbled and the Mittelwerk tunnels were abandoned, the V-2 stood as a symbol of contradiction. It was a masterpiece of engineering. It was a product of cruelty. It failed to change the outcome of World War II. But it succeeded in changing the direction of history. The war was ending. The rocket age was beginning. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the V-2 rocket program officially ended. But in reality, it was only beginning. As Allied forces moved through the wreckage of Nazi Germany, they discovered warehouses filled with rocket parts, blueprints, guidance systems, engines, and partially assembled missiles. Entire rail cars were loaded with components. Underground tunnels still contained tools, wiring, and test equipment. The United States acted quickly. American troops secured as much V-2 hardware as possible before Soviet forces could reach it. Dozens of intact rockets and thousands of technical documents were transported west. More importantly, the key engineers, including Wernher von Braun, were taken into American custody. Under Operation Paperclip, these scientists were quietly brought to the United States. Their past affiliations with the Nazi regime were downplayed or classified. The priority was clear: prevent Soviet access and use their expertise to advance American missile research. Meanwhile, in the Soviet zone, Red Army engineers dismantled what remained. Factories were stripped. German specialists were relocated to the Soviet Union to help rebuild rocket production from captured designs. The race had begun. The V-2, once launched in secrecy toward Allied cities, was now being studied openly in laboratories and desert test sites. In the United States, captured V-2 rockets were transported to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. There, beginning in 1946, American engineers reassembled and launched them for research purposes. These launches were not aimed at cities. They were aimed at the sky. The V-2 became a scientific tool. It carried instruments to measure atmospheric conditions. Cameras were mounted inside some rockets to capture images from high altitude. For the first time in human history, photographs were taken from the edge of space. The weapon of vengeance had become a research platform. But it was also becoming something more dangerous. The knowledge gained from V-2 testing directly influenced the development of ballistic missile technology. Engineers learned how to improve guidance systems, increase range, and stabilize reentry trajectories. As tensions grew between the United States and the Soviet Union, the former allies became rivals. The Cold War emerged almost immediately after World War II ended. Both superpowers understood the implications of ballistic missiles. If a rocket could carry a conventional explosive hundreds of miles, it could also carry something far more destructive. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, both nations were working toward intercontinental ballistic missiles, rockets capable of crossing continents. Nuclear warheads would eventually sit atop designs descended directly from the V2. The world had entered the missile age. In the Soviet Union, captured V2 technology became the foundation for the R-1 rocket, essentially a reverse-engineered copy. Soviet engineers then pushed further, developing larger and more powerful rockets. In 1957, a Soviet rocket launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. The space age had begun. In the United States, von Braun and his team continued refining rocket designs. Their work eventually led to the development of the Saturn V rocket, the machine that would carry astronauts to the Moon in 1969. The lineage was clear. The same principles tested at Peenemünde. The same fuel systems refined under wartime pressure. The same guidance concepts pioneered for destruction, now used to explore space. This transformation is one of history's great contradictions. The V2 rocket was created as a terror weapon. It killed civilians. It was built through forced labor. It drained resources from a collapsing regime. Yet it also proved that reaching the edge of space was possible. It bridged two eras, the age of artillery and the age of spaceflight. As the 20th century progressed, ballistic missiles became central to global strategy. During the Cold War, the threat of nuclear-tipped rockets defined international politics. Cities around the world lived under the shadow of missile launch warnings. All of it traced back to the V2. From the forests of occupied Europe to desert test ranges in America. From underground tunnels in Germany to launch pads sending satellites into orbit. The rocket that fell without warning had reshaped the world. The war had ended. But the consequences of the V2 were just beginning to unfold. When the last V2 rocket fell in March 1945, it did not end with a dramatic final battle. There was no decisive turning point. No last launch that changed the war. The rockets simply stopped rising. Germany collapsed. The factories were abandoned. The launch crews scattered or surrendered. The underground tunnels fell silent. But the silence did not mean the story was over. The V2 had proven something extraordinary. Humanity had built a machine capable of leaving the lower atmosphere, traveling faster than sound, and striking a target hundreds of miles away. It was the first true ballistic missile in history. And once something has been proven possible, it cannot be forgotten. The weapon that terrorized London and Antwerp had failed to stop Allied armies. It had not prevented Germany's defeat. It had consumed vast resources in a time when Germany could least afford it. It had cost thousands of forced laborers their lives in underground factories. Strategically, it was too little and too late. But technologically, it changed everything. The post-war world quickly divided into two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Each side understood that the next great war, if it came, would not be fought with slow-moving armies alone. It would be fought with rockets. The V2 became the ancestor of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Over the next decade, both nations developed rockets capable of crossing oceans in minutes. Nuclear warheads replaced conventional explosives. The destructive potential multiplied beyond anything imagined in 1944. The age of missile deterrence began. At the same time, another transformation was unfolding. The same rocket principles that carried explosives into cities were adapted to carry instruments into space. Cameras mounted on early V2 test flights captured the first images of Earth from high altitude. Scientists studied atmospheric data gathered from those launches. The boundary between warfare and exploration blurred. In 1957, Sputnik orbited Earth. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin traveled into space. In 1969, American astronauts walked on the Moon, lifted there by the massive Saturn V rocket, a machine whose engineering lineage could be traced back to the work begun at Peenemünde. The V2 had been designed to serve a regime built on conquest and destruction. Instead, its technological descendants carried humanity beyond the planet. This dual legacy is uncomfortable. The rocket was born from a dictatorship. It was built by forced labor. It killed civilians without warning. Yet it also opened the door to satellite communications, weather forecasting, GPS navigation, and interplanetary exploration. Modern life is shaped in part by rocket technology that began as a weapon. The V2 stands as one of history's clearest examples of how innovation can outlive the intentions of its creators. Technology itself is neutral. Its purpose depends on those who control it. In World War II, it was used for vengeance. In the Cold War, it became a symbol of deterrence and fear. In the space age, it became a stepping stone to discovery. Today, when rockets launch into the sky carrying satellites, probes, or astronauts, they follow trajectories first calculated under wartime pressure. The roar of engines rising from a launch pad echoes faintly with the first V2 launches decades earlier. The weapon from the future did not save the Third Reich. But it did shape the future of the world that defeated it. Its story is not simply about destruction. It is about transformation. About how war accelerates science. About how fear can drive invention. And about how the same technology can carry both bombs and dreams. The V2 fell in fire. Its legacy rose into space.